The dust kicked up by Samuel Garrett's boots settled slowly in the dim light of the ranch house as he paced the worn wooden floor, the tiny bundle in his arms seeming impossibly fragile against his weathered hands. The baby's cries had finally subsided into soft whimpers, and Sam found himself staring down at the small face that bore such a striking resemblance to Maria's delicate features. 3 days had passed since the fever took her. 3 days since his world had crumbled into something unrecognizable, leaving him alone with this precious remnant of the only woman he'd ever loved. The ranch stretched out beyond the windows in every direction, 2,000 acres of Montana prairie that he'd built from nothing with his own hands and stubborn determination. Cattle dotted the landscape like scattered brown stones, and the distant mountains stood sentinel against the evening sky. It was everything he'd dreamed of when he'd first arrived here 15 years ago, a young man with nothing but ambition and a head full of foolish notions about taming the wilderness. Now at 34 he felt older than his years, worn down by loss and the weight of responsibility that sat heavy on his shoulders. The baby stirred in his arms, tiny fingers grasping at the air, and Sam felt that familiar tightness in his chest. How was he supposed to raise a child? What did he know about babies and their needs? Maria had been the one who understood such things, who had spent months preparing for this moment with a joy that had lit up their modest home. She'd sewn tiny clothes with careful stitches, humming old Mexican lullabies that her own mother had sung to her. The rocking chair she'd chosen still sat in the corner, waiting for moments that would never come. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his thoughts, and Sam looked up to see the familiar silhouette of Martha Henley through the glass. The town's unofficial matchmaker stood on his porch with her hands on her hips, her silver hair pulled back in its usual severe bun. Even through the door, he could sense her determination, and he knew there would be no avoiding this conversation. "Samuel Garrett, you open this door right now." Martha called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades organizing the social lives of everyone within 50 miles. "I can hear that baby crying from the road, and we need to talk." Sam shifted the infant to one arm and opened the door, immediately regretting the decision as Martha pushed past him into the house. She took one look around at the dishes stacked in the sink, the unmade bed visible through the bedroom doorway, and the general chaos that had become his life, then turned to face him with an expression that mixed sympathy with exasperation. "I told you, you needed a wife," she said, her voice softer than her words suggested. "Even before Maria passed, rest her soul, I told you that raising children takes more than one person, especially out here where the nearest neighbor is 5 miles away." Sam felt his jaw tighten. "Martha, I appreciate your concern, but I can manage just fine. This is my son, my responsibility. I won't have you parading eligible women through here like this is some kind of cattle auction." Martha's expression didn't change, but she moved closer, her weathered hands reaching out to gently touch the baby's forehead. "This little one doesn't care about your pride, Samuel. He needs care, constant attention, feeding every few hours. When's the last time you slept? When's the last time you had a proper meal?" The questions hit closer to home than Sam cared to admit. He'd been surviving on coffee and whatever he could grab with one hand, stealing moments of sleep when the baby dozed. His ranch hands, good men though they were, had their own families and responsibilities. They helped where they could, but they couldn't fill the void that Maria's death had left in his life. "There's a woman," Martha continued, settling herself into Maria's rocking chair without invitation. "Rebecca Walsh. She arrived on the stage from Colorado last week, looking for work. She's been staying at the boarding house, helping Mrs. Patterson with the cooking and cleaning, but she's got experience with children. Lost her own husband to consumption 2 years ago." Sam turned away, walking to the window where he could see his cattle moving slowly across the pasture. "I'm not looking for a replacement for Maria, Martha. I won't dishonor her memory by rushing into some arrangement just because it's convenient. Nobody's asking you to replace her," Martha replied, her voice taking on a gentler tone. "But that baby needs a mother's care, and you need help whether you're too stubborn to admit it or not. Rebecca's not looking for romance, Samuel. She's looking for security for a purpose. Her husband left her with debts and no family to speak of. It could be a practical arrangement, nothing more." The word practical stuck in Sam's throat like bitter medicine. His marriage to Maria had been anything but practical. They'd met at a church social in town, and he'd been struck dumb by her beauty, and the way she laughed at his clumsy attempts at conversation. Their courtship had been brief but intense, filled with stolen moments and passionate promises about the future they'd build together. The thought of reducing marriage to a business transaction felt like betrayal. But as the baby began to fuss again, requiring the kind of attention Sam was still learning to provide, he found himself wavering. The ranch demanded his attention during daylight hours, and the cattle wouldn't tend themselves. Winter was coming, and he'd need to prepare feed, repair fencing, and handle a dozen other tasks that required him to be away from the house for hours at a time. What would happen to his son then? "Bring her by tomorrow," he said finally, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. "I'll meet her. But I make no promises, Martha. This is about what's best for the baby, nothing more." Martha nodded, satisfaction evident in her expression. "That's all I'm asking for. Give her a chance, Samuel. Sometimes what we need isn't what we think we want." After Martha left, Sam spent the evening caring for his son, heating milk on the stove and trying to remember Maria's instructions about feeding and changing. The baby seemed to sense his uncertainty, crying more than usual, and by the time dawn broke over the mountains, Sam felt like he'd aged another year overnight. Rebecca Walsh arrived the next afternoon in a simple brown dress that had seen better days, her auburn hair pinned back practically rather than fashionably. She was younger than Sam had expected, perhaps 26 or 27, with intelligent green eyes that took in everything without seeming to judge. Her hands were work-roughened, and she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who'd learned to rely on her own strength. "Mr. Garrett," she said simply, offering him a slight nod. "Mrs. Henley explained your situation. I'm sorry for your loss." There was no false sympathy in her voice, no attempt to minimize his grief with empty platitudes. Sam found himself appreciating that more than he'd expected. "Thank you. Would you like some coffee? It's not much, but it's hot." They sat at his kitchen table, the baby sleeping peacefully in Rebecca's arms as if he'd known her all his life. She held him naturally, comfortably, and Sam caught himself studying her face as she looked down at his son. "He's beautiful," she said softly. "He has his mother's eyes." "You knew Maria?" Rebecca shook her head. "No, but Mrs. Patterson told me about her. She said she was kind, that she had a gift for making people feel welcome." They talked for nearly 2 hours, carefully circling around the subject that had brought them together. Rebecca told him about her life in Colorado, about the small farm she and her husband had tried to make work before the sickness took him. She spoke of her experience caring for her younger siblings before her marriage, of the children she'd hoped to have but never did. "I'm not looking for love, Mr. Garrett," she said finally, meeting his eyes directly. "I learned that life doesn't always give us what we dream of. But I am looking for purpose, for a place where I can be useful. Your son needs care, and you need help. It could be a fair arrangement for both of us." Her honesty was both refreshing and painful. Sam found himself thinking of Maria, of the way she'd looked at him on their wedding day with eyes full of dreams and promises. This woman offered something different, something practical and undemanding. It should have been easier, but somehow it felt harder. "What would you expect from such an arrangement?" he asked. "A home," she replied simply. "Security. The chance to care for a child who needs me. I don't expect affection or romance. I understand this would be a marriage of convenience. Nothing more." Sam spent that night walking the perimeter of his ranch, the baby sleeping against his chest in a carrier Rebecca had fashioned from one of Maria's shawls. The familiar rhythm of his boots on the hard, packed earth helped clear his mind, and he found himself really looking at his land for the first time since Maria's death. The ranch was thriving, the cattle healthy and numerous, but it felt empty without someone to share it with. Not in the romantic sense that he'd shared it with Maria, but in the practical sense of having another adult presence to help shoulder the daily burdens. By morning, he'd made his decision. Rebecca accepted his proposal with the same quiet dignity she'd shown from the beginning, and they were married 3 days later in a simple ceremony at the small church in town. Martha beamed with satisfaction. Several of the local women offered congratulations, and Sam felt like he was watching someone else's life unfold. The first months were awkward as they learned to navigate their unusual arrangement. Rebecca proved to be everything Martha had promised and more. She cared for the baby with gentle competence, managed the household with quiet efficiency, and never once complained about the isolation or the hard work. She asked for nothing beyond basic necessities and seemed content to fill her days with the endless tasks that came with ranch life. Sam found himself watching her sometimes, noting the way she hummed while she cooked or how she smiled when the baby reached new milestones. She never overstepped the boundaries they'd established, never pushed for more than he was willing to give, but her presence gradually began to ease the crushing loneliness that had threatened to overwhelm him. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of harsh weather that tested everyone's resolve. The cattle needed constant attention, and Sam spent long days in the bitter cold, ensuring they had access to feed and shelter. More than once, he returned to the house exhausted and half-frozen, only to find Rebecca waiting with hot food and quiet concern. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this," she said one evening after he'd stumbled in from a particularly brutal day. "You're going to make yourself sick. The cattle won't tend themselves," he replied, accepting the cup of coffee she pressed into his hands. "This is what it takes to make a ranch work." "I understand that," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "But you're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. Maybe it's time to think about hiring more help, or at least letting the men take on more responsibility." It was a practical suggestion, the kind that Maria might have made, but it carried none of the emotional undertones that had colored his conversations with his first wife. Rebecca approached problems with a clear-eyed pragmatism that Sam was beginning to rely on more than he cared to admit. The baby, now 6 months old and thriving under Rebecca's care, had become the bright spot in both their lives. He'd grown into a happy, curious child who smiled easily and seemed to bring out the best in everyone around him. Sam often caught Rebecca singing to him in the evenings, old songs that she claimed her mother had taught her, and he found himself lingering in the doorway to listen. Spring brought new challenges and new possibilities. The cattle had survived the winter in good condition, and Sam began making plans for expanding the herd. Rebecca surprised him by offering practical suggestions about breeding programs and pasture management, revealing a knowledge of ranch operations that he hadn't expected. "My first husband raised cattle," she explained when he asked about her expertise. "I helped him with the books and the planning. I know it's not my place to offer advice, but I couldn't help noticing some things that might improve your operations." "It is your place," Sam found himself saying. "This is your home now, your ranch too. Your insights are welcome." Something shifted between them after that conversation, a subtle change in the dynamic that had governed their relationship. Rebecca began offering opinions more freely, and Sam found himself valuing her perspective on everything from household management to ranch operations. They developed an easy working partnership that made both their lives more manageable. The baby took his first steps that summer, wobbling across the kitchen floor into Rebecca's waiting arms while Sam watched from the doorway. The joy on her face was unmistakable, and Sam felt something twist in his chest at the sight. This woman had given up her own dreams to care for his child, had asked for nothing in return, and was now celebrating milestones that should have belonged to Maria. "He's growing so fast," Rebecca said, scooping the toddler up and spinning him around until he giggled with delight. "Soon he'll be running all over the ranch, getting into everything." Maria would have loved to see this, Sam said quietly, and immediately regretted the words. They seemed to cast a shadow over the moment, a reminder of the ghost that still stood between them. But Rebecca just nodded, her expression understanding rather than hurt. "I'm sure she would have. He's lucky to have had a mother who loved him so much, even if she couldn't stay to watch him grow up." It was a generous response, more generous than Sam deserved, and he found himself looking at this woman with new eyes. Somewhere along the way, without his noticing, Rebecca had become more than just a practical solution to his problems. She'd become a partner, a friend, and perhaps something more that he wasn't ready to acknowledge. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Sam found himself dreading the approach of winter, not because of the harsh weather, but because it would mean longer evenings spent in close quarters with Rebecca. The attraction he'd been trying to ignore was becoming harder to dismiss, and he felt guilty for having feelings that seemed to dishonor Maria's memory. The crisis came in October, when an early blizzard caught them unprepared. Sam had been out checking on a herd in the far pasture when the storm hit, and he barely made it back to the house before the full fury of the weather descended. Rebecca met him at the door, worry evident in her eyes, and helped him out of his snow-covered coat. "I was afraid you wouldn't make it back," she admitted, her hands shaking slightly as she hung his coat by the fire. The wind has been howling for hours, and I kept watching the road. The admission surprised him. Throughout their marriage, Rebecca had been careful not to reveal too much emotion, not to make demands or express needs that went beyond their practical arrangement. To hear her admit to worry, to caring about his well-being in a way that went beyond mere concern for her security, stirred something deep in Sam's chest. They spent 3 days trapped in the house by the storm, and the enforced intimacy broke down barriers that had stood between them for months. They talked about their pasts, their hopes, their fears for the future. Rebecca revealed a sense of humor that he hadn't suspected, and Sam found himself laughing for the first time since Maria's death. On the second night, as they sat by the fire while the baby slept peacefully in his crib, Rebecca asked the question that had been hanging unspoken between them for months. "Do you think you'll ever be able to care for someone again, Samuel? Really care, not just accept them as a convenient arrangement?" The question hit him like a physical blow, forcing him to confront feelings he'd been struggling with for weeks. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "Maria was my first love, my only love. I thought when she died that part of me died too. But lately, I've been wondering if maybe there's room in a man's heart for more than one kind of love." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. "I loved my first husband," she said finally. "Not passionately, perhaps, but deeply and truly. When he died, I thought I was done with love, done with hoping for more than just survival. But being here, caring for your son, working alongside you, I've started to wonder if maybe I was wrong." They didn't touch that night, didn't cross any physical boundaries, but something fundamental shifted between them. An acknowledgement, an opening of possibilities that neither had been willing to explore before. The storm passed and life returned to its normal rhythms, but the conversation by the fire had changed everything. Sam found himself seeing Rebecca not as Maria's replacement or as a convenient solution to his problems, but as herself, a woman of strength and grace who had brought light back into his dark world. Winter deepened, and with it came the kind of intimacy that can only develop between two people who share daily struggles and small triumphs. They worked together seamlessly now, anticipating each other's needs, supporting each other through the challenges that came with ranch life and raising a child. The baby, now walking confidently and beginning to form words, seemed to sense the change in their relationship and thrived in the warmth of their growing affection. The moment of reckoning came on a February night when Rebecca fell ill with the same kind of fever that had taken Maria. Sam found himself reliving his worst nightmare, watching helplessly as the woman who had become central to his life struggled against the sickness. He sat by her bedside for 3 days, refusing to leave, caring for both her and the baby with a desperation born of the knowledge that he couldn't bear to lose someone else he cared about. When the fever finally broke and Rebecca opened her eyes to find him slumped in the chair beside her bed, she smiled weakly and reached out to touch his face. "You look terrible," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the illness. "I thought I was going to lose you," he admitted, catching her hand in his. "I couldn't bear it. Not again." "You care about me," she said, "and it wasn't a question." "I love you," Sam replied, the words coming out in a rush. "I've been fighting it for months, feeling guilty about it, but I can't deny it anymore. I love you, Rebecca. Not the same way I loved Maria, but just as deeply, just as truly." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she squeezed his hand. "I love you too, Samuel. I have for months. But I didn't think you'd ever be ready to hear it." They were married again that spring, this time in a ceremony that celebrated not convenience but genuine affection and commitment. Martha Henley beamed from the front pew, clearly pleased with her matchmaking success, while the baby toddled between them during the service, drawing chuckles from the gathered friends and neighbors. As summer returned to the ranch, Sam often found himself marveling at the turn his life had taken. The lonely rancher who had sat cradling his baby in desperation had been transformed into a man with a full and loving family. Rebecca had proven Martha right in ways that went far beyond the practical, bringing not just competent care but genuine love into their home. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching their son chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Rebecca leaned against Sam's shoulder and sighed contentedly. "Martha was right, she said softly. "You did need a wife. But maybe I needed a husband and a child just as much." Sam pulled her closer, thinking of Maria and the love they'd shared, then looking at Rebecca and the different, but equally precious love they'd built together. Sometimes what we need finds us when we least expect it, he said, even when we think we're not ready for it. The baby ran up to them then, his small hands full of the glowing insects he'd been chasing, his face bright with the kind of innocent joy that children possess. As Rebecca scooped him up and Sam wrapped his arms around them both, he realized that Martha's prophecy had been fulfilled in ways none of them could have imagined. He'd found not just a wife, but a partner, a friend, and a love that honored the past while embracing the future. The months that followed brought new challenges and deeper bonds. Sam's son, now 2 years old, had begun calling Rebecca Mama, a development that initially caused Sam some inner turmoil until Rebecca gently addressed his concerns one evening as they prepared for bed. "He'll never forget his birth mother," she said softly, brushing her hair by the window. "But children need someone to call Mama in the present, someone who's there when they scrape their knees or have bad dreams. Maria will always be his first mother, the one who gave him life. I'm just the one who gets to help him live it." Her wisdom and generosity of spirit continued to amaze Sam. She'd found ways to honor Maria's memory while building her own relationship with the boy, telling him stories about the beautiful woman who had loved him before he was born, showing him the tiny clothes Maria had sewn with such care and hope. The ranch prospered under their joint management. Rebecca's suggestions about breeding programs had proven astute, and their cattle were gaining a reputation for quality throughout the territory. She'd also convinced Sam to plant a vegetable garden, arguing that they could reduce their dependence on expensive supplies from town. What had started as a practical venture became a source of joy for all of them, with their son helping. By pulling up as many vegetables as weeds, his chubby hands always dirty and his face always smiling. As their third summer together approached, Rebecca began showing signs that she was carrying their child. The news filled Sam with a complex mixture of joy and terror, memories of Maria's difficult pregnancy and tragic death mixing with hope for the future he and Rebecca were building together. Rebecca seemed to sense his fears without needing them spoken aloud. "Every pregnancy is different," she told him one evening as they walked through the pasture, their son riding on Sam's shoulders and pointing excitedly at the cattle. "I'm strong, Samuel. I've helped deliver babies before and I know what to expect. Morrison is much more experienced than the doctor who attended Maria, and Mrs. Patterson has promised to come stay with us when the time comes." Despite her reassurances, Sam found himself hovering over Rebecca as her pregnancy progressed, earning gentle teasing from the ranch hands and amused tolerance from his wife. She bore his protectiveness with good humor, understanding the source of his anxiety, even when it frustrated her practical nature. The baby arrived on a crisp October morning, a healthy daughter with Rebecca's green eyes and Sam's stubborn chin. As Sam held his daughter for the first time while Rebecca rested peacefully in their bed, he felt a completion he hadn't known he was seeking. Their son, now 3, was fascinated by his tiny sister, insisting on helping with everything from diaper changes to feeding time. "What should we name her?" Rebecca asked, her voice tired but happy as she watched Sam cradle their daughter. Sam had been thinking about this moment for months, and his answer came without hesitation. "Hope," he said simply. "Her name is Hope." Rebecca smiled, understanding immediately. This child represented not just their future together, but proof that life could begin again after loss, that love could grow in the spaces left by grief without diminishing what had come before. As winter settled over the ranch, the family found its rhythm with 4 members instead of 3. Sam often worked late into the evening, making up for time spent helping with the baby during the day, but he never resented the extra burden. Watching Rebecca nurse their daughter, while their son played quietly nearby, filled him with a contentment he'd thought lost forever. The harsh Montana winter tested them all, bringing blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures that made even the hardiest cattle seek shelter. During one particularly brutal stretch in February, they lost a dozen head to the cold despite their best efforts. Sam stood in the barn, looking at the remaining cattle and calculating the financial impact when Rebecca found him there. "We'll make it through," she said simply, slipping her arm through his. "We always do." "The loss is significant," Sam replied, his breath visible in the cold air. "It might mean delaying some of the improvements we planned, maybe hiring fewer hands for spring roundup. Then we'll work harder ourselves," Rebecca said with the matter, a fact tone that had drawn him to her from the beginning. "We've faced worse and survived. This is just another challenge, not the end of the world." Her unwavering strength bolstered his resolve, and together they developed plans to minimize their losses and prepare for a better year ahead. The crisis brought them even closer, proving that their partnership could weather not just personal struggles but professional setbacks as well. Spring brought renewal in more ways than one. The surviving cattle were healthy and strong, and several neighboring ranchers, impressed by the quality of Sam and Rebecca's stock, made offers to purchase breeding bulls. The extra income allowed them to hire additional help and begin the improvements they'd postponed. More importantly, spring brought visitors in the form of Rebecca's sister and her family, traveling from Colorado to see the new baby and the ranch they'd heard so much about in letters. Sarah Walsh was younger than Rebecca, with the same practical intelligence but a more outgoing personality. Her husband, Jim, was a schoolteacher, and their 2 children were close in age to Sam's son. "You've built something beautiful here," Sarah told her sister as they sat on the porch one evening, watching the children play in the yard while the men discussed cattle prices. "I can see why you're so happy." "It wasn't always this way," Rebecca replied honestly. "The first year was hard, learning to live with someone who was still grieving, trying to find my place in a life that had been shaped by another woman's dreams. But Samuel is a good man, and love found a way to grow even in difficult soil." Sarah studied her sister's face in the lamplight. "You really love him, don't you? Not just gratitude or affection, but real love." "As much as I loved Thomas," Rebecca said, referring to her first husband. "It's different, built on friendship and respect rather than youthful passion, but it's no less real. Samuel has taught me that the heart is bigger than we think, with room for different kinds of love without one diminishing the other." The visit lasted 2 weeks, and when it came time for Sarah's family to leave, there were tears and promises to write more often. Sam found himself moved by the obvious affection between the sisters and the way Rebecca's family had embraced him and the children without reservation. "They like you," Rebecca said as they waved goodbye to the departing wagon. "Sarah told me she'd never seen me so settled, so content with my life. I like them too," Sam replied, surprised by how much he meant it. "It's been years since I've had family around. I'd forgotten how good it feels." As their daughter took her first steps that autumn, wobbling across the kitchen floor, just as her brother had done 2 years earlier, Sam reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The lonely rancher who had once sat cradling his baby in desperation had become the patriarch of a thriving family and a successful ranch. Martha Henley visited regularly, always claiming some excuse about checking on the baby or bringing preserves, but clearly taking satisfaction in the success of her matchmaking efforts. She'd aged in the years since bringing Sam and Rebecca together, her hair whiter and her steps slower, but her sharp eyes still missed nothing. "I told you, you needed a wife," she said one afternoon as she watched Hope chase butterflies in the garden while her brother helped Rebecca harvest vegetables. "Though I have to admit, even I didn't expect it to turn out quite this well." "You were right about more than you knew," Sam replied, leaning against the porch railing. "Rebecca brought more than just practical help. She brought healing and hope, and a kind of love I didn't think I deserved." Martha nodded with satisfaction. "Love comes in many forms, Samuel. The trick is recognizing it when it appears and having the courage to embrace it, even when it's not what we expected." As the sun set over the Montana prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, Sam gathered his family on the porch for their evening ritual of watching the day fade into night. Rebecca sat beside him, their daughter drowsy in her lap, while their son leaned against his father's knee and pointed out the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. The ranch stretched out before them, prosperous and peaceful, the cattle moving slowly across the pasture toward their evening shelter. The mountains stood eternal against the horizon, witnesses to the struggles and triumphs of the people who had chosen to make their lives in this harsh but beautiful land. "Tell us about Mama Maria," their son said sleepily, using the name he'd learned to distinguish between his birth mother and the woman who raised him. It had become a bedtime tradition, these stories about the beautiful woman who had loved him before he was born. Rebecca's voice was soft and warm as she began the familiar tale, weaving together memories Sam had shared with her own imaginative details about Maria's kindness and dreams. Hope dozed in her mother's arms while her brother listened with the fascination children always show for stories about themselves. As the story ended and they prepared to go inside for the night, Sam took one last look at his domain. The lonely rancher was indeed lonely no more. surrounded by love in forms he could never have imagined during those dark days after Maria's death. Martha's prophecy had been fulfilled beyond anyone's wildest dreams, proving that sometimes the best things in life come not from getting what we want, but from accepting what we need. The matchmaker's words echoed in the evening air like a blessing on the family they'd become, a reminder that love, like the hardy prairie grass, finds a way to take root and flourish even in the most unlikely soil. The ranch that had once echoed with solitude now rang with laughter and the sound of children's voices, a testament to the healing power of time, patience, and the courage to open one's heart to unexpected possibilities. And in the growing darkness, with his family safe beside him and his land prospering under their care, Samuel Garrett finally understood that some kinds of loneliness can only be cured by learning to love again, differently perhaps than before, but no less deeply or truly. The matchmaker had indeed been right, he had needed a wife. But more than that, he had needed to learn that the human heart, like the endless Montana sky, is vast enough to hold all the love we're brave enough to let in.